Mark Schoenberger for National Guitar Repair. The next couple of videos in the series are going to be concerning the very beginnings of National, its prototype and its production. The very beginning of National has sort of been shrouded in a mystery, in that nobody really knows when the round neck guitars came into the scene. What about the 40 prototypes that were built by John and Rudy? Which actually I've never seen any of those. But I've seen enough of the very early guitars to tell me that very early on they meshed the guitars together. You had round necks and square necks in the very beginning. Some had diamond holes, some didn't have diamond holes. And actually what John should have said was that the very first 40 guitars were very different from each other in production. Well, believe it or not, this design wasn't good enough for them. This classic deco design, they felt as though needed to be spiffed up somehow. They put diamonds in it. One guitar, they didn't have diamonds, but they had crude engraving. They would cover up the diamonds and put engraving on the diamonds. They would put screens under things. And so it took them about 40 guitars before someone said, enough, this thing is beautiful, let's just go with that. So the first video we have is on serial number 102, the very second guitar. It's a hand-built prototype. Let's take a closer look. Oddly enough, one of the first things I noticed when I first saw this guitar, or at least that I looked for, was the decal up here. I'd seen this guitar in Bob Brosman's book and studied pictures of it for years, but it didn't have a shot of the headstock. The earliest guitars that I'd worked on prior to this had a smaller decal. It's about 3/4 of this size, and they came in different colors. There was red, blue, sort of lime green, and black. And I think I saw a large red one, but this is a large black one, and it says a couple of things. One of the things it tells us is that they decided that they liked the big decal the best. And not only that, they liked this color combination the best, the black background with the red letters. John Dopier would have been responsible for the woodworking on this instrument. Rudy would have done the metal work. I love the little hand-cut headstock slots and the faux finish that mirrors the fretboard here. Now this is a maple, or at least a chunk of maple, and it's a solid chunk of maple. There's no breaking until the 10th fret where it stops. And this is unusual because the production model had a totally different setup. They had a mahogany headstock that was just spliced in here and some wood chips under here that were drilled out to lighten up the instrument. So it's really cool to see this solid, massive chunk of guitar here. It's really impressive. The Dopier brothers started out as banjo makers, and it's reflected here in a couple of ways. One is that they continued to use their sort of funny little rounded banjo fret wire, and also they had a position marker at the 10th fret. This dot at the 10th fret is what they would have done on a banjo. Normally, you'd have a 9th fret dot here for a guitar. It would have been Rudy that did the metal work on this body, and he gave it this lovely, elegant neck that tapers down with an elegant swoop right here, and a slightly thinner body than the normal production instrument would have had. As you see, this body is nickel silver, and it's not plated. That's important. Here you can see these large, uneven solder joints here because you've got the hand hammered edge and it gets filled in with solder, and it doesn't always form the nicest, cleanest line. When I was speaking with Don Young at National, he told me that he was talking to John Dopier, and the original intent was not to have these instruments plated at all. And I think what you're looking at is the reason why they actually had to plate their instruments. So this is the last of the non-plated instruments. Let's take a look at these fabulous grills. These are the only ones that were ever hand woven. This puts a lot of tension on the metal, and they're really impossible to solder up like that. I once did a wooden tricone with wooden grills, and man, it took forever to get those things to stick. So I can see why they only did this once. The other cool thing about these is that these are lovely hand-hammered bits right here. And if you feel along here, you can feel the hammer marks. I mean, how cool is that? Let's look at this cover plate next. You can see these hand-cut diamonds are really just a piece of folk art in and of themselves. And the other interesting thing here is they cut slots here and they've just folded this over like a box. It's kind of cool. And here's something that's interesting too on the flange. You'll see the flange goes all the way to the edge of this design right here, and it sort of interrupts the flow. Later on, they'd knock the flange back so you could see the cover plate underneath it, and it really helped with the design. It really flowed through. It was brilliant. Here's the other side of the cover plate. We'll just ignore the modern masking tape. But you can see how sort of primitive it is. You can see the cut marks. You can feel the solder blobs and the cut marks on it. And you can see the slight variations. One of my favorite is this piece right here. It says a lot. It's got this funky little jog to it. But man, they were dying to get this thing up and running. Here's number 102, right there at the top. And you'll see it's got a flat back on it. I'll show this. And they continued with a flat back on for quite some time until they came to the stamped domed back. And now my favorite part. Look at that. See the little fleur-de-lis in here? The other thing I like about this too, you put these over here, is this little raised piece of cardboard with 2 tacks in it. It was originally painted silver, and you could see where they had a couple little felt pads because they had some cone problems before. One of the really cool things about this is actually taken from a piece of furniture. You've got a mahogany veneer here. And if you look over here, there's this thin strip of mahogany, the nicer face on top. So it's kind of cool that this was a generation that didn't waste anything. Now underneath the pan would have been these supports here that would have kept pressure on the back so it didn't get all flooby. And these would have been made out of nickel silver with a little collar here and a post. So this is your basic post and pad, but out of nickel silver. It would have had a felt pad on the back, and it's just wonderful. It's hand cut. You can see these edges over here. It's just a great piece. One of the interesting things about all this is that you've got silver painted pan, you've got these nickel silver pieces on the inside, and it's all sort of meant to give this impression of just one piece of metal without little interruptions. And it's kind of a little stealth thing they had going on here. Well, let's talk about the structure here. It consists of the 3 cones, spun out of aluminum, and this massive aluminum sandcast bridge. Didn't have a slot for a wooden piece. It was all meant to be strings on aluminum on the wooden pan into this nickel silver body. This is the last time you'd see this bridge for a couple of reasons. One is the next version sort of removed these flanges and became a very skeletal bridge because they realized they didn't need this much mass. The other thing is that they'd made it too short. You see they've got this little cutout here so that the cones can fit together. And it's actually worse than that because underneath here are little cups in the casting that were supposed to sit directly upon the cones themselves. But they actually had to put flat washers underneath so they could just cheat everything out just a little bit more, and they still had to cut away over here and over here. And the other thing too is that these cones were about 1/16 of an inch smaller than the other non-spiral cones that they made after this. The other unusual thing about this whole setup is that it's got screws here, and the screws go to these little nuts and washers underneath. And these nuts and washers we know are original for a couple of reasons here, is that it fits so perfectly, and they also have the same silver paint to stop the nuts from coming off that they use on the pan over here. And later on they realized that they just had to have the pressure of the strings holding down the bridge here, and it held everything just fine. The aluminum they used on this was about 6/1000. And the other thing it had going on here is that it was spun all the way to the very edge. Now that's very unusual, and I hadn't seen that before. I was speaking with Don Young about this, and he confirmed that. The later ones, they would spin to here and then put in a wooden form and stamp the edge. And this one has just this elegant spun edge all the way to the edge. So that was our closer look at the prototype. In our next video, we'll take a look at the very first production guitar. I'm Mark Schoenberger for National Guitar Repair. I'll see you again.